The next session is another fireside chat titled It's Time, Confronting Technology Ethics Questions. The increased stress due to the pandemic and changes in the way we work, live, and even interact with societies has led to ongoing ethical questions. This segment will focus on the industry leaders answering these questions and a discussion on rebuilding trust in technology. To tell us more, I would like to invite the chair for this session, Keshav Murugesh, Group CEO, WNS Global Services, and past chairman of NASScom. Keshav is responsible for executing the business strategy and directing the overall performance and growth of the 42,000 plus people organization across 16 countries and 60 offices. He's known as the turnaround guy and has been at the helm of global majors such as Syntel and ITC, an affiliate of BAT PLC. Over to you, Keshav. The stage is all yours.
Harvard has a very interesting initiative called Embedded Ethics. It embeds philosophers directly into computer science courses to teach students how to think through the ethical and social implications of their work. Real-life ethical conundrums find their way into technical content as both computer science and philosophy instructors teach side by side. Students are confronted with questions for which there are no obvious correct answers. But what they get educated on is not just about what systems they can build, but whether they should build them at all. So why is this so important? As the digital era rose to its summit in the last decade, it was greeted with wonder and optimism as a means to enhance lives and business. In recent years, however, public sentiment has been significantly clouded in many ways with rising concerns around data privacy, social media's role in spreading false information, and opaque metrics and corporate algorithms that favor some groups over others. Beyond using technology to solve problems, the time has now come to look at the different societal implications and the trade-offs in trust that are made in arriving at the perfect technology solution. This then is the crux of ethics in technology. How can it authentically gain the trust of its users? In today's session, we have just the person who can share some of her very interesting views and perspectives on this subject, and that is Paula Goldman. Paula is the Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce, a company that has unequivocally made their stand on technology absolutely clear. She is a champion of technology for social good and has focused tremendous efforts in helping companies build ethical technology. She is also the founder and director of Imagining Ourselves, a project of the International Museum of Women. She has been awarded with numerous accolades, including the Social Impact Award from the Anita Borg Institute for Women and Technology. This program has been curated so that you get the best perspectives from our very distinguished guest. Paula will now give her opening statement about what ethics actually means in technology, after which we have quite a few questions for her. Well, over to you, Paula.
Oh, thank you so much for that really interesting and fascinating introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here today. I was really looking forward to this conversation. I want to begin by saying I'm a techno optimist. I believe, and I've always believed, and I still believe, that technology opens up worlds of opportunity for people. And we see that all around us, and we continue to see that all around us. I think that technology and kind of the technology industry right now is in a moment. And it's important to see this moment through the lens of history, because we've been here before. Maybe rewinding back, about 100 and so years to when commercial automobiles were first introduced. And I can tell you, when they were first introduced, I sort of looked into the history of this. It was absolute chaos because there were still horses and buggies in the streets. So I'm like thinking about, for example, what it was like in New York in the early 1900s. Horses and buggies and people and cars all colliding with each other. The historian of that time said it was more dangerous to try to cross the street as a pedestrian than to try to cross the Atlantic in a tiny little boat, right? So people were dying in accidents. It was total chaos. And then there arose a concerted effort between governments, industry, and civil society to define the rules of the road, so to speak. And, it was a few years later when the introduction of a stop sign, you don't think of stop sign as a miraculous invention, but there it was, right? And then the introduction of roundabouts and traffic rules and so on and so on. And finally, several decades later, the introduction of seat belts and safety features in cars, which then became a competitive advantage. My point is, many industries have gone through this before, where an innovation is introduced that has a lot of potential to open up many opportunities for people. And it needs some shared norms about how that technology will be governed and how people will use it together, right? And so within that, we've even seen it within the tech industry itself. So a couple of decades ago, for example, we saw security become an issue within tech. And all of a sudden, computer viruses were taking down entire companies and systems, and no one knew what to do about it. But then what ended up developing was a whole sort of, technology security industry, a set of norms, a set of expectations, a set of professional responsibilities around it. And I think we're in a similar moment with technology that really requires all hands on deck. It does require, it requires government, it requires civil society, and it requires technology companies themselves to take on this level of responsibility, to think through when they're building technology, what are the implications of this technology in the world? And it's really an honor to be part of this movement, because I think it is so crucial to how technology impacts us all as individuals, which is, growing impact on our everyday lives.
Well, that's really fascinating, Paula. And I must say that if you've got us, starting to think all over again, and a refreshing change from the robotic kind of people we've become. Well, I have a few questions for you that will probably go a little deeper into the aspects of ethics in technology. So my first one is, it's a really interesting office at Salesforce that you lead. The Office of Ethics and Humane Use. Now, how was this actually conceived? What really is the scope of your vision for this role? What gives you happiness or gratification in terms of performance metrics for this role? And when you were actually offered this role, how did you overcome that thought that maybe this could be a superfluous role?
Sorry, maybe this could be a what?
A superfluous role in this world of today.
Yeah. Well, I'll take your questions in order. So about the founding of the office. So Salesforce has always been a values-driven company from the very start. Led a lot of work around defining what philanthropy looks like for tech companies, and so on and so forth. And I think we believe that ethics can be a business differentiator. And we approach it with a spirit of humility because we certainly do not have all the answers. And in fact, oftentimes it's more about asking the question than having the definitive answer. But we hope that by sharing what we're learning, we can help technology companies move forward together. And what I will say is that the world today looks very different than, Salesforce was founded in 1999. The speed of innovation around technology has no doubt delivered extremely positive outcomes and opportunities. And the potential for technology is to make human beings better, right? Is to open up opportunities for us to better our own lives. But at the same time, as I said, there's all these issues that are now in the forefront that maybe people did not predict, like bias and artificial intelligence, like privacy, and what is we call kind of a growing techlash. That is to say, the scrutiny on technology companies as some of the biggest companies in the global economy. And that is why Salesforce started the Office of Ethical and Humane Use in 2018. And it's also why we focus on what we call ethics by design. And that is the incorporation of ethical principles into the process of designing, building, and shipping our software and services. And it's also why we, as the Office of Ethical and Humane Use, have developed a robust process along with our technology and product teams to evaluate the way in which our products and services are used. So that's about the founding. You also asked about kind of the gratification and you said it more politely, but it was kind of like, why was I crazy enough to take this job? So in terms of the gratification, it's really about cultural transformation. And kind of at the end of the day, I work on a lot of very technical issues and projects, but I see my highest and best goal at Salesforce is to reinforce a culture where everyone owns ethics and where everyone's thinking about the potential unintended consequences of the products that they're building and thinking really critically about, sometimes the answer for what the best path is not clear. And it requires really thinking through various angles on an issue. And so, we are slowly but steadily seeing more and more people coming to us with the questions rather than us coming to them, right? And that's what you want. You want everyone to own it. And you want everyone to feel comfortable, not only that they won't, say, be punished for bringing up these issues, but in fact that it's actually their responsibility to bring up these issues. And I would say in terms of why I took the job and kind of what some of the bigger misconceptions are on the job. I would say I took the job because it's such a big challenge, right? I love going into spaces where, where the path forward is not defined and you're kind of creating a blueprint, borrowing from wisdom of others, but trying to create a path forward. And I would say in terms of misconceptions, it's really about preparing for the unexpected. And this is, I think this is probably very similar in the world of technology security or in a lot of domains right now, given the turbulence of the world. You're never prepared. You have to have sort of frameworks and processes and you have to guess what's going to happen. But the truth is that the world events every week kind of throw us on our heels and we have to recalibrate the decisions we've made in light of new information all the time, which is challenging and it's also fun.
Very interesting. By itself, technology does not have context or ethics. At best, it's a value-creating intermediary between the user and the environment that the user works in. Trust, on the other hand, is highly dependent on understanding the context that we are surrounded by. Today, we find an erosion in public trust for businesses, particularly for technology companies, despite all the value that they have been creating. How do you think companies can rebuild this, this trust through their engagement? And what, according to you, in culture and leadership helps organizations transition from legally compliant to more ethically compliant? And what do you see are common roadblocks on that path to progress?
That's such a good question. And yes, I agree that we are definitely in a crisis of trust. That crisis of trust is global. And that crisis of trust is not just technology companies, although I think that is a very big focus. But it's also, with science, with companies writ large, with basically any institution. And it's deeply important that we address this crisis of trust, because the solutions to our big problems as society, across the board, depend on trust, right? So how to rebuild? I really think it comes down to two things. The first is listening. Listening is deeply important. And so, for example, within Salesforce, our office is constantly testing new ways to listen at scale. So we have office hours. We create listening sessions with employees. Sometimes we will, hire an outside person to come in and facilitate, and we won't even be in the room. And we'll say, like, hey, we're going to gather you. We want your thoughts on a particular topic. We're going to anonymize the results. We just want to listen. We want to make sure you're super comfortable, sharing without any fear that it's attributed to you whatsoever, right? We just want the honest perception. Sometimes we, or very often I should say, we bring in communities that we think might be impacted or have a stake in the technology that we're developing. And that is, we do that in two ways. The most important way is we try to make our employee base as diverse as possible and as representative of the communities that we're serving, right? So that we're actually listening to all those perspectives, by design as we're building our products. But we also we also consult the organizations representing these groups as well in the development of our products and in the development of policy around our products. So I could not say more. Listening, I think, is the absolute foundation. The second is about transparency. And that's also really important. And I think there's kind of a growing public disease about, I should say, how technologies are created and for example, what data is this technology gathering? And so, for example, last year when the COVID pandemic hit, we created a number of technology responses to it. We created a product called work.com, which helps businesses reopen safely. And it has things like a wellness check that helps people, attest to being well enough to go back to work, that kind of thing. And we worked very carefully with those product teams, not only to minimize the data that was being collected in that technology, but also to be super transparent, right? So if you're a user and you go through that flow, you know exactly what data is being collected and by whom and for how long. It's that kind of thing. It's that level of transparency that I think can turn the tide. Because look, these issues are super complicated. By definition, they're super messy. And there isn't always a single right answer. But the more that that companies can demonstrate active listening, that they're really open to lots of perspectives and that they're actively including those perspectives in the decision making very seriously, and that they're sharing, like, look, this is exactly what, this is exactly what happened, and this is exactly how we've designed something. May not be perfect, but it goes a long way to rebuilding trust.
Talking about COVID-19, well, the World Economic Forum has said that while rapid technology developments during the crisis have actually saved lives and have helped countries actually sustain, the reality also is that in these kind of situations, during a recovery process, if there is not enough governance, it's also possible that inequality could emerge. So while we know that data usage and privacy is really a primary concern, but are there any other concerns that your team foresees? And what would be your approach to mitigate these?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. And I'd say at the high level that data privacy and governance and questions of equality and human rights go hand in hand, and they often intersect in really important ways. So what happened for us was when it was clear there was a global pandemic, and you may recall, like, it took a little while for it to sink in, like, what's happening? And oh, this is actually affecting the entire world. Like, what are we going to do? Our team took a step back and said, what does good technology look like during a pandemic? And referencing that there have been other crises where new technology has been developed to help communities go through it, and that privacy, amongst other things, is always a concern with these technologies. And so we created a set of principles without necessarily it was like, let's create a blueprint. What does good technology look like in a pandemic? And so, and those principles, in rank order, interestingly, the first one wasn't privacy. The first one was human rights and equality, because of the reason that you just said, right? Because you can, in a crisis, reinforce existing inequalities. Then transparency, as we talked about before, then data minimization, then taking a long-term approach, right? Because the data, you might collect data today, which might be very valid in a moment of crisis, and which 2 years from now has, not the same utility and not the same rationale for collecting it, but you still have that data. Do you still need that data? And then finally, ensuring the security of personal data. So our approach was taking a really close partnership with product teams and partners and customers, leveraging expert voices and community voices and creating mechanism for feedback, and then planning after the crisis. But I think what you're saying is we see all over the world, right, that the people that are hardest hit by the pandemic are the people that are already the worst off. And you want to make sure, as you're developing technology that's supposed to help everyone, and it does help everyone, that you're paying a special attention to the people who are the most vulnerable, and making sure that they have access to that technology, that they are not excluded, and that they understand what data is being collected. And that's extremely important during a crisis.
That's great advice. I have one final question for you, and that is, beyond the direct COVID-19 recovery, there's also a lot of talk around how technology has impacted our health during this pandemic. We seem to be spending too much of time in front of screens and also on social media. While, technology companies cannot be held totally responsible for this problem, can they take a proactive stance to help in some way? And also, in the context of this pandemic, we just saw an announcement from Salesforce that the 9-to-5 workday is now dead. What do you think could be the impact of that announcement on all that we spoke about as well?
Yeah, well, two really good questions. And on the first, I'm glad that my husband and children are not in the room, because I'm constantly doom scrolling on my phone. I'm on a screen all day. So I'm personally impacted by that problem. And I really think, there's a number of interventions, but there's also just a process and a mindset that's really important with technology companies. And that is really just about thinking about the unintended consequences of what we're building. So we have a methodology that we use internally called consequence scanning. And that is, taking product teams about how, okay, you're building this product today for this one purpose. How does it scale over time? And how does it impact people when it scales, right? And does that solve all the problems? No, but I can guarantee you that that when these initial technologies that you're talking about were developed, it was all utopian optimism, right? And well-deserved optimism. It was gonna, technology was gonna democratize everything, but no one considered the downside. And that doesn't mean that we only focus on the downside, but we have to we continue to focus, be optimistic of like the huge potential that technology has for the world, but also design around the harms as well. Try to avoid the harms, right? So as far as your second question, now I've lost it. Tell me it again. Your second question.
It's the announcement about the.
Oh, right. Our work from anywhere. Our work from anywhere. Well, I don't know about you. I never thought I could work from home for a year and not lose my mind. And I'll be honest. I've gotten close a couple of times, but I think what we've seen is there's a new normal in terms of how business is conducted, right? The fact that you and I are having this conversation over Zoom without thinking twice about it, that entire conferences like this conference is like the level of virtuality is just now normal. It doesn't mean that in person doesn't matter. I think, once things resume back to normal, there will be a lot more in person, but it's not going to go back to where it was. And that means that these same technologies that we've become dependent on, whether that's Zoom or, just, the lifeblood of business being online, right, to find their customers, that's going to become more and more important, which means that our responsibility as technologists is even more important, because now it's not just like something that people are interacting with once or twice a day. It's something that people are interacting with all day, every day, all the time. And so it means we've got a job to do.
So that's like the new normal for us. Well, thank you, Paula, for those really far-reaching views on how we can harness the power of technology while also keeping it responsible and ethical. Greek mythology has a story about Daedalus, who created wings of feathers and wax for his son Icarus to escape the island of Crete. Don't fly too low because your wings will get wet in the ocean, he warned his son. And don't fly too high or close to the sun because the wax will melt and you will lose your feathers, is what he said. That then is the gist in technology. The truth is, there is no stopping. It's all encompassing and invasive reach in co-shaping all lives as well as realities. And while technology innovators aim to create value for their users, they will also need to understand the direct and indirect impact of their creations. So I'll end there, but back to you, Shreya.
For that thought-provoking conversation. For me, what stood out in the conversation was, of course, remember the Harvard course on embedded ethics that Keshav referred to on the ethical and social implications of technology, and of course, the guide to students when faced with the dilemma of what kind of systems they should build and whether they should build them at all. We're also in the midst of ethical issues that have proven to be a great threat, and it may be the time to look back at the 20th century and really reflect on where we are today and why we are here. We're also at that juncture when the rules of cyberspace are still being formalized, and the fact that Paula calls herself a techno-optimist also stayed with me. I'll leave you with this quote by the former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Potter Stewart, who said, "Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do."